Everyone in the neighborhood knew who Shin Aryam was, which meant they knew her parents' company name and the model of car in their driveway. And the kids at the playground knew this too and organized their games accordingly. The invitation to play cost a snack from her bag, a turn on her bicycle, the specific currency of being near the richest kid on the block. Aryam sat at the far end of the playground on the swing that nobody wanted because it hung lower than the others, doing nothing, watching a girl she didn't know arrange pebbles on the ground in what appeared to be a city. Hannah looked up from her pebble city and found the girl in the white dress looking at her from the low swing. Not the way people usually looked, which was assessing or classifying or asking for something, just looking, with the specific quality of someone who has been watching something they find interesting and got caught. Hannah said, "Do you want to see the city?" The girl on the swing said very carefully, "Yes." Aryam came off the swing and crouched beside Hannah in the dirt, her white dress immediately acquiring a streak of dust at the hem, which she did not appear to notice. Hannah explained the layout of the Pebble City. Here is the market, here is the park, this big pebble is the library, and Aryam listened with the complete attention of someone for whom things were usually explained at them, rather than to them. She said, "Where do you live in the city?" The children who had been occupying Aryam's bicycle noticed she had gone and came to retrieve her, the way you retrieve something you borrowed, and the ringleader said, "Aryam, come play with us. We're doing teams." And Aryam, who was examining the library pebble with serious attention, said without looking up, "I'm already playing." The children looked at Hannah. Hannah looked at them. Then she moved the big library pebble 1 centimeter and said to Aryam, "Actually, this should be the hospital." It was Hannah who first pushed the rusted gate open. She said, "I've been wondering what's in there," and Aryam, who had been told a dozen times not to go near the property at the edge of the park, said, "Me too." The garden inside had gone completely wild, which was better than a garden, and the front door was unlocked, which was the most interesting thing Hannah had encountered in some time. She went in first. Aryam followed. The room with the east-facing windows was on the 2nd floor, and the glass was intact, and the view was the oak tree, which was enormous from this height, and the afternoon light came through the dirty glass in long amber columns that made the dust look like something else. Hannah said, "This should be a place we know about." Aryam looked at the light columns and then at Hannah and said, "Okay, They met at the abandoned house every afternoon that summer, Tuesday and Thursday specifically, because Hannah had a reading club on Mondays and Wednesdays and Aryam had piano. Both sets of parents became aware of this. Hannah's mother because Hannah came home with dust on her yellow t-shirt every Tuesday and Thursday at 5 p.m. And Aryam's mother because the housekeeper reported that the young miss had been going somewhere that was not the arranged playdate locations. Hannah's mother followed her on a Thursday, not to intervene, just to see, and found Shin Aryam sitting on the observatory room floor sorting through a collection of old buttons she and Hannah had found in the house, handing them to Hannah one by one for Hannah to categorize. Sujin stood in the doorway for a moment, looked at Aryam's pristine family name, and her dust-streaked white dress, and her complete focus on a box of old buttons, and went home and made 3 servings of dinner instead of 2. Shin Yujin came to the Lee apartment on a Saturday morning to meet the child her daughter had been disappearing with all summer, and found a quiet girl with messy hair eating rice with Aryam at the kitchen table, while Aryam's father negotiated the delivery of a rare book from somewhere. She said, "You're Hannah?" And Hannah said, "Yes." And Yujin looked at her daughter, who was eating rice quietly beside this quiet girl, and thought, she has not sat still at a meal in 3 years. By August, they were known at the neighborhood convenience store as the 2 kids who came in together on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 3 p.m. The neat one who always paid and the one with the messy hair who always chose the snack. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. O, kept a small box of Hannah's preferred crackers behind the counter, after the 3rd time Aryam had bought the entire stock. He never mentioned this. He just always had them. Aryam's parents told her on a Sunday evening in the main sitting room, both of them present, which meant it was significant that she had been accepted to a prestigious academy abroad and would be leaving after the summer. Aryam sat in the large chair across from them and said, "When?" And her father said, "September," and she said, "No." And her father said, "Aryam." And she said very clearly, "No." She found her mother in the hallway afterward and said, "I want Hannah to come with me." And her mother said, "Aryam, that's not." And Aryam said, "I'll pay for everything." Her family doesn't have to. And Yujin crouched down and took her face in both hands and said, I know, but we cannot make decisions for another family's child. Aryam said, then I'm not going. Eugene said, you are going. And Aryam cried in the hallway in a way she had not cried since she was very small, and her mother held her, and the decision did not change. Yu-chan found his wife in their bedroom doorway an hour later and said, she'll adjust. And Yujin said, she made a friend. Not the kind she usually makes. He said, there will be more. And Yujin said, Yu-chan, she has known that child for 3 months, and she has not once asked us to buy something for her. Yu was quiet for a moment. He said, I'll arrange a generous study fund. Hana told her parents at dinner on a Monday night. She said, Aryam is going abroad in September. Her mother put her chopsticks down. Her father finished his bowl of rice first, which was not insensitivity. It was how he processed significant information. He said, do you want to go see her before she leaves? Hana said, we already have plans. Her mother looked at her bowl for a moment and said, you can invite her here for dinner anytime before she goes. They had one Tuesday left. They went to the abandoned house without discussing it, the same way they had gone every Tuesday that summer, except both of them knew it was the last time, and neither of them said so yet. Aryam had brought a small tin box she had found in her room. She said, for things we want to keep here. Hana said, okay. They went up the stairs to the observatory. They put things in the tin box to leave there. A button from the button collection, a pebble from the pebble city. Hana chose the library turned hospital pebble. A folded piece of paper where Aryam had written down the name of the convenience store cracker she always bought for Hana, and Hana had written the reading schedule she was on. When the box was sealed, Aryam said, I want to give you something. She opened her palm. 2 thin silver rings, simple, the kind you find in an old house. Aryam said, so we know each other even when we don't see each other. And Hana looked at the rings and said, like a phone number but more difficult to lose. And Aryam laughed, which was the specific laugh she only laughed with Hana because it was too honest for other people. They put them on, right ring finger, both of them. Aryam said, promise. Hana said, promise. Sujin made the invitation exactly as she had said she would, and Aryam came to the Lee apartment on a Thursday evening and sat at the modest kitchen table, and ate soup that was not expensive and was the best thing she had eaten all summer. Dongwon told her a story about an electrical fault he had fixed that week, with a solution he made from a rubber band and a toothpick. The way he told stories. Quiet and precise and funny at the end. Aryam laughed at the rubber band and toothpick part, and did not pretend she didn't. The car came on a Saturday morning in September, and Aryam stood at the Lee apartment entrance with her family's driver, and 2 suitcases and her mother, who had come to say goodbye in person to Sujin. The girls stood facing each other and neither of them said anything useful. Hana said, send me the cracker brands from there and tell me if they're good, and Aryam said, I will. And that was the correct thing to say, neither of them knew why. Aryam's mother watched her daughter not cry, which was harder to watch than crying would have been. Aryam got in the car and the driver closed the door, and the window was slightly tinted and Hana could see her through it. Her face in profile, looking forward, the dark braid over one shoulder. Then Aryam turned her head and looked directly through the tinted window at Hana for 3 full seconds, and Hana raised her right hand with the silver ring on it. Aryam pressed her right hand flat against the window glass. The car moved. Hana was 12 and in a different classroom, and her teacher noticed the ring during a handwriting exercise and said, is that a family piece? And Hana looked at the thin silver ring on her right ring finger and said, sort of. The girl beside her said, where did you get it? And Hana said, someone gave it to me, and left it there. She got a text from an international number that night that said, I tried 3 different cracker brands today. None of them were right. She replied, what are you looking for? Aryam replied, yours. At 14, Aryam had a group of girls who followed her around the academy dining hall, the way things accumulated around money and status, and they laughed at exactly the right moments, and agreed with everything she said and borrowed things they always returned. She sent Hana a photo of the academy dining hall one evening, and wrote, everyone here is very agreeable. Hana replied, is that good? Aryam replied, no. Hana replied, okay. Aryam replied, okay. Okay. At 15, Hana had a routine that suited her. School, the neighborhood bookstore where she helped after class, dinner with her parents, reading until 10. Ji-young had been her friend since second year of middle school, and sat beside her on the bus, and filled the silence with things that needed filling, and left the other silences alone. Hana was reading a novel on the bus one Tuesday when she realized she still thought of Tuesdays as a specific day. Hana was 17, second year of high school, sitting at her usual desk near the window, when the class homeroom teacher announced that a transfer student would be joining on Monday from a school abroad. Young said, "Transferred in second year?" And Hana turned to look at the teacher, and the teacher said the family name. And Hana looked at her right ring finger. The ring was the same. She had not thought about it in months. She was thinking about it now. Shin Yujin called Lee Sujin on a Sunday afternoon. Sujin was at the bookstore doing inventory, and said, "We are moving back. Ariam asked to be enrolled at the local high school, which is, I believe, your daughter's school." Sujin set down the inventory clipboard and sat on the small bookstore stool and said, "She requested it specifically." Eugene was quiet for a moment and then said, "She requested everything specifically." On Monday, Ariam arrived at the school in the uniform. White shirt, dark blazer, dark skirt, the same as everyone else. Except that nothing about it looked the same as everyone else, because she stood at the school entrance with her dark hair in a high clean half ponytail and her dark eyes scanning the entrance, with the specific focus of someone looking for one specific thing among many. The school noticed her within 40 seconds. She was not looking at the school. Ariam found her at her locker on the second floor at 7:52 a.m. She had gotten the locker number from the administrative assistant by saying she was trying to return something a classmate left, which was technically true if the 8-year gap and the specific urgency of wanting to see her before first period didn't factor in. Hana had her back to the corridor and was putting her bag in the locker, and Ariam stopped 5 feet away and did not say anything for a moment. Hana sensed someone had stopped and turned around. The way you turn around when the foot traffic around you has changed, and found a very tall girl in a perfectly pressed school uniform with a high half ponytail, and dark eyes that were looking at her the specific way of someone who has been looking for something for a long time. Hana's first thought was, "I know that face." Her second thought was, "I have known that face for 8 years from memory." Her third thought was nothing because she said out loud, "Ariam?" Hyung watched the reunion from approximately 4 feet away because she had been walking toward Hana at the time and stopped when she saw Hana's expression change. And she filed everything she saw under, "Extremely significant. Investigate further." At lunch she said to Subin, "The transfer student knows Hana," and Subin said, "The one everyone is talking about." And Ji-young said, Hana looked at her like she just found something she forgot she lost. Subin said, "That's a lot." Young said, "It was a lot." By Wednesday, Shaeyeon had identified the transfer student as a social opportunity, and had positioned herself at Ariam's side with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been maintaining a social position for 3 years. Ariam tolerated her the way she had always tolerated the Shaeyeons of her life, present, acknowledged, interchangeable, and when Shaeyeon said, "Who is that girl you were talking to on Monday?" Ariam said, "A friend." And the specific weight she put on the word friend was something Shaeyeon filed and kept. Ariam was tracking Hana's route from second period English to the third floor stairwell, which took 4 minutes and 20 seconds, and she knew this because she had walked it twice at lunch when the halls were empty to calibrate. She was not following Hana. She was making sure she understood the geography of where Hana was during the day, which was a different thing, and if anyone had asked she would have said she was just learning the school layout. Nobody asked. On Thursday, Ariam sat down at the lunch table adjacent to where Hana sat with Ji-young and Subin. Not at the same table, adjacent, and opened her bento and began eating with the complete composure of someone who had made a normal special decision. Young looked at the adjacent table, looked at Hana, looked at the adjacent table again. Hana was eating. Subin offered Ji-young a cracker. Young accepted it without looking away from the adjacent table. Hana stood up, carried her tray to the adjacent table, and sat down across from Ariam. She said, "You're going to get a reputation for eating alone." Ariam said, "I'm not alone. I'm adjacent." Hana said, "That's not a real thing." And Ariam said, "It is now." And Hana looked at her and said, "You're the same." Ariam said nothing. Hana said, "I mean that as a good thing." Ariam looked at her soup. On the walk home, Ji-young said, Who is she? Hana said. I told you. We were friends when we were kids. Jiyoung said. She transferred schools to your school in second year and sat next to you at lunch, and you have matching rings. And Hana looked at her right hand and said, they're not matching, they're the same. Jiyoung said. Hana, that's the same as matching. Subin, who had been walking on Hana's other side eating crackers, said, they're cute. Minji sat next to Hana in 2 classes and had a mild, obvious, harmless crush on her that the entire class was aware of except Hana. He left an extra eraser on her desk on Tuesday morning, and she said thank you and used it without further comment. Aryam, who had been watching from 3 rows back in the same classroom, filed this under a category she did not name. She asked Shaeyeon at lunch. That boy in second row. Shaeyeon said. Minjae? He's nice. Aryam said. Yes. The next Tuesday, Aryam arrived in class before Minji and left a better eraser on Hana's desk. A proper drawing eraser, clean, more useful than the small one. She sat down 3 rows back. Hana arrived, saw the eraser, looked around and said, who left this? And nobody said anything because Aryam had arranged to be looking at her notebook. Hana put it in her pencil case. Aryam turned a page she had not been reading. Jiyoung was not. She would like it noted, unintelligent. By the end of the second week, she had mapped the transferred school, the adjacent lunch table, the eraser, the way Aryam tracked Hana through crowds without appearing to, and the matching rings. She said to Subin on the way to the convenience store, she has been in love with Hana since they were 9 years old. Subin ate a cracker and said, does Hana know? Jiyoung said, Hana thinks they're just friends. Subin said, that tracks. Hana worked at her mother's bookstore on Saturday afternoons, which Aryam had learned from the class schedule. Hana kept in her notebook, which Aryam had briefly seen opened on Hana's desk. She came in on a Saturday with the specific composure of someone who had not planned this, set a tote bag on the counter and said, I'm looking for something in the contemporary fiction section. Sujin, who was behind the counter, said, Hana can help you, and went to the back room to make tea for 3. Sujin made tea in the back room and thought about the 8 years that had passed, and the child in the pristine white dress, who had sat on the observatory room floor, sorting buttons for an afternoon, and the young woman at the counter, who had clearly arrived with a tote bag, full of something other than shopping intentions. She came back out with 3 cups and set them on the counter and said to Aryam, you've grown. Aryam said, you're the same. Sujin said, that's kind. Aryam said, it's accurate. Hana walked Aryam through the contemporary fiction section with the specific efficiency of someone who knows every shelf, pulling out recommendations without being asked for them. Aryam took each book Hana handed her and looked at the back cover. And when Hana said, this one's about 2 people who find a place that becomes theirs, Aryam took it and did not say anything. She bought 4 books. She had read 3 of them already. She didn't mention this. Minji came into the bookstore on a Saturday afternoon 2 weeks later. He had been before, he liked the history section, and found Hana behind the counter and said, hey, I didn't know you worked here, and started talking to her about a history book he'd been meaning to buy. Aryam, who was in the fiction section pretending to browse, went very still. She was not reading the page she was on. She had not been reading the page she was on for 4 minutes. Aryam came to the counter with the book she was not reading and set it down in front of Hana, and said, I'd like to buy this. And Minji said, oh hi, are you Aryam? And Aryam looked at him with the specific look of someone conducting a rapid assessment and said, yes. And Minji said, I know who you are, in the tone of someone for whom this was not a pleasant discovery. Hana said, Aryam, be nice. Aryam said, I am being accurate. Jiyoung was the first person outside of Hana to notice that Aryam was always within 20 feet of Hana during school hours. She also noticed that Aryam had never in 2 weeks done anything that could be called frightening. She did not intercept or block or prevent anything. She just arranged to be present. Jiyoung told Subin, I've been thinking about this wrong. Subin said, how have you been thinking about it? Jiyoung said, like it's something to be worried about. I think she's just extremely sad about being alone. 3 weeks after the transfer, Hana asked Aryam if she wanted to walk to the old neighborhood after school. She said it the way she said things, directly and with a lot of context. Aryam said. Okay. They walked for 20 minutes, which Aryam had also walked twice on her own at lunch already, and arrived at the entrance to the park. Hannah said, I still go sometimes. Aryam said, I thought you might. Aryam said, I thought you might. The rusted gate was still open. The oak tree was larger. The garden was worse, which was better. They went up the stairs without discussing it, and the observatory room was still there, the east-facing windows intact, the afternoon light still coming through the dirty glass and long amber columns. Hannah said, It's the same. Aryam said, Yes. She said it very quietly. Hannah looked at her and then at the light columns and said, We should check if the tin box is still here. The tin box was under the floorboard they had hidden it under, still there, the contents intact. The button, the library-turned-hospital pebble, the folded paper with the cracker name and the reading schedule. Hannah opened it and held the pebble and said, I forgot it said hospital. Aryam said, You changed it. Hannah said, Yes, and then, we should put something new in. Aryam reached into her school blazer pocket and put in a photograph she had been carrying for 3 weeks. Hannah looked at the photograph. It was the two of them at 9, at the playground, with the Pebble City. Hannah looked at the photograph in the tin box and said, How long have you been carrying that? Aryam said, A few weeks. Hannah looked at her. Aryam said, more quietly, Longer. Hannah said, Did you ask to come to this school because of me? The observatory was very quiet. The amber light columns moved slightly in the air. Aryam said, Yes. Hannah said, Okay. Aryam said, Okay. And Hannah said yes, okay. And Aryam looked at the amber light coming through the dirty window for a moment, and the 8 years settled into the room. Eugen told her husband that evening that she had seen the light in their daughter's face for the first time in years. He said she's settled in the school. Eugen said, She is settled in a person, and he said, Eugen, and she said, I know. She is 17. I know. I'm not saying anything needs to happen yet. I'm saying she has stopped eating rice with 1 foot already out of the room, and I would like it noted. He said, Noted. The class field trip was to a botanical garden, and Aryam arrived at the bus in the morning and sat beside Hannah without asking, which had become a pattern that the class had collectively decided was simply the situation now. Jiyoung sat across the aisle and brought crackers and offered them to everyone, including Aryam, who took one, which Jiyoung noted as a social advance. Shaeun sat 3 rows back and looked at the window and thought, I do not understand what is happening, and I have not for 3 weeks. At the botanical garden, the class spread out in groups and Aryam stayed within 10 feet of Hannah, with the practiced naturalness of someone who had been doing this for a month. Jiyoung was the only person who had mapped the distance exactly. The two of them reached a garden path where the light came through the canopy, the way it came through the observatory windows, and Hannah stopped walking. She said, This is a good spot. Aryam stopped beside her without looking away from the light. Jiyoung found Aryam at the Botanical Garden Cafe, where Aryam had gone to get 2 things from the counter. She had not asked Hannah what she wanted. She had simply returned with the specific thing Hannah always got. Jiyoung sat down across from her and said, I want to tell you something. Aryam said, All right. Jiyoung said, I think you are a good person who has been very lonely for a long time. And I think Hannah is the only person you have ever trusted to just be around. And I think that is a lot to carry by yourself. Aryam looked at the table for a moment and said, I have been around a lot of people. Jiyoung said, I know. Aryam said, It's different. Jiyoung said, I know that too. Aryam said, I don't. She stopped. She started again. I don't know how to want something without feeling like I'm asking for a transaction. Jiyoung said, Yeah, and then, Hannah doesn't work that way. Aryam said, very quietly, I know. That's why. On the bus back, Jiyoung sat beside Subin and ate crackers and said, I understand her now. Subin said, And? Jiyoung said, She's not dangerous. She's just been at a party for 8 years where everyone wanted something from her and the one person who didn't moved away, and she has been quietly holding that space open since she was 9. Subin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That's kind of devastating. Jiyoung said, I know. Cracker? Hannah came to Ariam at the school entrance the next morning, and held up the snack Ariam had gotten her at the Botanical Garden Cafe, and said, "How did you know this is what I always get?" Ariam said, "You mentioned it once." Hannah said, "I have never mentioned that." Ariam said, "You mentioned it implicitly." Hannah looked at her for a long time. She said, "Ariam, are you paying attention to my snack preferences?" Ariam said, "I pay attention to everything about you," and then looked like she had not planned to say that. Ariam came home from school and found her mother in the sitting room and sat down in the chair across from her. The same chair, the same room 8 years later, and said, "I told her I pay attention to everything about her." Eugen set down her book and looked at her daughter. She said, "What did she say?" Ariam said, "She didn't say anything right away. She just looked at me like she was deciding something." Eugen said, "What did you feel?" Ariam said, "Like I was waiting for a verdict." Eugen said, "And?" Ariam said, "It didn't feel bad." Hannah texted Ariam on a Saturday and said, "Are you free?" And Ariam said, "Yes." And Hannah said, "The house." She was already there when Ariam arrived in the observatory room, in her pale yellow home, knit top, and dark jeans, the childhood color. She had kept it. And she said, "I've been thinking about what you said at the entrance." Ariam said, "I know." Hannah said, "I looked at you, and I thought, I've been wearing this ring for 8 years and I never told anyone where it came from." Ariam said, "I know." Hannah said, "Why did you think that was?" Ariam said, "I don't know." Hannah said, "I think you do." Ariam said, "I have never wanted something for nothing until you." Hannah looked at her for a long time and then said, "You're not very good at asking for things, are you?" And Ariam said, "I've never had to ask before. Everything just came because of what I have." Hannah said, "I know. I've never had what you have, and I think you know that." Ariam said, "That's why. I could never, with you. It was never because of anything except you." Hannah said, "I know that too." Hannah stepped forward and took Ariam's right hand in both of hers, and looked at the silver ring on Ariam's right ring finger. The same ring 8 years? And said, "I've been wearing mine for 8 years, because I didn't want to take it off." Ariam said, "Why?" Hannah said, "I don't know. I didn't examine it. I think now I did know." She pressed her right hand alongside Ariam's right hand. Both rings facing up, both silver, both the same. Ariam said, "I'm not very good at this." Hannah said, "You're doing it." Eugen told her husband on a Sunday morning while he was reading the company reports. She said, "Ariam called me last night. He said, 'Is she all right?' She said, 'She is the most all right she has been in years.' He said, 'The school is working out.'" Eugen said, "The school is a person." And she waited, and he set down the reports and said, "Hannah, the Lee girl." Eugen said, "Yes." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I owe Lee Sujin a call." Mr. O, at the convenience store, saw them come in on a Tuesday afternoon, both in their school uniforms, Ariam paying, Hannah choosing the snack, the same as it had always been when they were 9, and said nothing, because he had not said anything in 8 years about the crackers he kept behind the counter. He put a small box of the crackers on the counter as they approached. Hannah said, "We didn't order those." Mr. O said, "Tuesday special." Ariam looked at him. He did not explain. They went back to the observatory on the first Saturday of spring, and the east-facing windows were bright with the new light, and the tin box was still under the floorboard. Exactly as they had left it the Saturday of the confession. The button, the pebble, the folded paper, the photograph, and one more thing. Ariam had added a folded note while Hannah was looking at the oak tree, which said only, "I looked for you for a long time. I found you twice. I'm not leaving again." Hannah read it in the observatory light and said nothing. She took Ariam's hand. "That was everything."